At 6:42 a.m. on an otherwise unremarkable autumn morning in Chicago, a jogger cut across a narrow footpath in a neighborhood park where the grass was still wet with dew and the city had not yet fully woken up. And that was when he noticed something that did not belong there, something so still and so wrong that his mind rejected it before his eyes could fully understand it. Near a cluster of trees, partially concealed by shadow and fallen leaves, lay the body of a man positioned with unsettling precision, his limbs aligned as if deliberately placed, his jacket pulled tight around him despite the mild weather, and a single gunshot wound to the back of his head that told a silent but unmistakable story of intent. Within minutes, the park was sealed off by yellow tape that fluttered weakly in the morning breeze, squad cars idled at odd angles along the curb, and uniformed officers moved with the practiced calm of people who had seen death before but never quite grew used to it, especially not in places like this. This park was supposed to be quiet, almost forgettable, the kind of place parents brought their children in the afternoons and dog walkers passed through without a second thought, not a place where someone was executed with such cold efficiency. Detectives quickly noted the absence of a struggle, the lack of shell casings nearby, and the eerie fact that nothing appeared to be stolen, as if robbery had never been part of the equation. Then, less than 36 hours later, before the first victim's name had even faded from the local news cycle, another call came in. This time, the body was found just under 2 miles away, in a different park but under chillingly similar circumstances. Early in the morning, tucked into a quiet corner where visibility was low and witnesses were unlikely. The victim was another adult male, another single gunshot wound to the back of the head, another scene marked not by chaos but by control. The precision was unmistakable now, and so was the implication that Chicago was not dealing with an isolated incident, but with something far more deliberate, far more unsettling. The city's homicide unit moved quickly because they had to, because patterns like this had a way of accelerating if left unchecked, and because someone out there had just proven they could kill, disappear, and do it again without hesitation. Detectives began pulling footage from nearby cameras, traffic lights, apartment buildings, corner stores, and public surveillance systems that quietly watched over the city day and night, recording thousands of hours of mundane movement in hopes of catching the rare moment when something went terribly wrong. And that was when they saw him. On a grainy black and white video timestamped just minutes after the estimated time of death, a lone figure appeared at the edge of the frame, emerging from the direction of the park and moving calmly toward a nearby sidewalk. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about him. Average height, dark clothing, face partially obscured by a hood or cap, hands close to his body as if tucked into pockets. But when detectives watched the footage again, and then again, something about the way he moved made them stop and rewind. His walk was wrong. Not rushed, not limping, not erratic, but unmistakably strange, with knees bent outward and feet angled in an unnatural way, producing a side-to-side waddle that looked almost comical if it weren't paired with the knowledge of what had just occurred moments earlier. It was a gait so distinct that one detective reportedly remarked that he could pick it out of a crowd of 1,000 people, a walk that looked less like a human stride and more like something learned, practiced, or ingrained over time. When footage from the second crime scene was reviewed, the room fell silent. There he was again. Same posture, same unusual, duck-like walk, same unhurried pace, as if he had nowhere else to be and nothing to fear. The timestamps aligned with chilling accuracy, placing the figure near both parks at precisely the windows investigators believed the murders had taken place. In a city saturated with cameras, where anonymity was increasingly difficult to maintain, this man had somehow left behind the most identifiable calling card imaginable without revealing a single usable detail about who he was. The media seized on the footage almost immediately. Local news stations looped the video endlessly, freezing frames, zooming in on the suspect's legs, inviting body language experts and former law enforcement officials to speculate about what the walk might mean. Some suggested an old injury, others proposed a neurological condition, and a few went so far as to theorize that the walk was intentional, an affectation designed to distract, confuse, or even mock the people watching from the safety of their living rooms. Online, viewers gave him a name that would stick long after the headlines faded: the Duck Walk Killer. But for all the attention the video received, for all the shares and comments and late-night discussions, it failed to do the one thing everyone expected it to do. It did not lead to an arrest. As the days passed, then weeks, then months, the investigation expanded outward in widening circles, touching neighborhoods, workplaces, social groups, and personal histories, yet always circling back to the same haunting image of a man walking away from murder with a strange, almost casual sway. Tips flooded in at first, as they always do, ranging from earnest attempts to help to wild accusations fueled by fear and imagination, but none of them held up under scrutiny. No weapon was recovered. No definitive motive emerged. No witness could say, with certainty, that they had seen the suspect's face clearly enough to recognize him again. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the story began to slip. National outlets moved on to louder, bloodier cases, ones with clearer villains and easier narratives, while this one remained trapped in a gray space between too disturbing to forget and too unresolved to conclude. In Chicago, the parks reopened, the tape came down, and people returned to their routines, stepping over the same paths where two men had been quietly executed, often without realizing what had happened there at all. Somewhere in the city, a man with a walk no one could forget had blended back into the crowd, leaving behind nothing but questions, footage, and the unsettling realization that sometimes, even when a killer is caught on camera, justice can still walk away. To understand why these two murders sent such a deep, lingering unease through Chicago, it is important to understand the moment in which they occurred, because by 2018 the city believed it knew violence well, believed it had learned how to anticipate it, categorize it, and, if not prevent it, then at least explain it. Chicago had long lived with crime statistics, heat maps, and neighborhood-by-neighborhood narratives that attempted to give order to chaos, but what happened in those parks did not fit neatly into any of the familiar boxes. These were not gang shootings carried out in broad daylight with witnesses who knew exactly what they had seen but were too afraid to speak. They were not crimes of passion, fueled by arguments that spiraled out of control, nor robberies gone wrong, marked by panic and haste. Instead, they felt quiet, surgical, almost clinical, as if someone had stepped briefly out of the shadows, performed a task with chilling restraint, and vanished without leaving emotional residue behind. That, more than anything else, was what unsettled people. The parks themselves played a crucial role in the public's reaction. These were not isolated wastelands or neglected corners of the city where danger was expected, but modest, everyday spaces woven into the rhythm of neighborhood life. Parents pushed strollers there in the afternoons. Elderly residents walked slow loops for exercise. Teenagers cut through on their way home from school, and joggers passed through at dawn and dusk without a second thought. Parks were supposed to be neutral ground, places that belonged to everyone, and the idea that someone could be executed there, quietly and efficiently, felt like a violation of an unspoken social contract. Technology, ironically, made the fear sharper rather than softer. By 2018, the public had grown accustomed to the idea that cameras were everywhere, that crimes were increasingly solved not by chance encounters, but by digital footprints, metadata, and high-definition footage that left little room for mystery. People believed, perhaps naively, that if something truly horrific happened, there would be an image clear enough, a clip sharp enough, to point directly at the person responsible. The duck walk killer shattered that assumption in a way that felt deeply personal. The footage existed, undeniably so, but it did not deliver closure. Instead, it teased the possibility of recognition without ever granting it. Viewers could see the suspect's outline, his posture, the rhythm of his steps, but never his face in a way that mattered. The image became a kind of modern ghost story, proof that surveillance did not equal safety, and that being watched did not necessarily mean being protected. Inside the Chicago Police Department, the atmosphere surrounding the case was tense but restrained. Detectives knew that execution-style killings often pointed to personal motives, past conflicts, or targeted retribution, and they worked under the assumption that the victims were not random, even if the location seemed public and impersonal. Every detail of the victims' lives was scrutinized, from their employment histories and financial records to their personal relationships and digital communications. The question was not just who had killed them, but why these men, and why now? Witnesses, such as they were, offered little comfort. A handful of parkgoers reported seeing a man in dark clothing around the time of the murders, but in a city of millions, average height, dark clothes described an endless number of people. No one heard shouting. No one reported a struggle. The gunshots themselves were either suppressed, distant, or simply absorbed into the constant background noise of the city, mistaken for construction, fireworks, or traffic. The absence of drama at the scenes only deepened the sense that the killer had planned carefully, choosing moments when the city was least likely to notice. The media, meanwhile, struggled to frame the story. Without a clear suspect, a known motive, or a dramatic chase, the coverage leaned heavily on atmosphere and speculation. News anchors spoke in lowered voices. Headlines emphasized words like execution style, caught on camera, and still at large. The duck walk footage became the centerpiece of every segment, replayed so often that viewers began to feel as if they knew the killer's movements intimately, even though they knew nothing at all about the person beneath the clothes. And yet, despite the fear and fascination, the case never quite crossed the threshold into national obsession. It lacked the sprawling body count of a serial killer, the sensational courtroom drama of a high-profile trial, or the celebrity connections that so often propel crimes into the national spotlight. Instead, it lingered in a strange middle ground, deeply disturbing to those who followed it closely, but easy for the rest of the country to overlook. For the people living near those parks, however, the shock was not theoretical. It was felt in small, everyday changes: joggers altering their routes, dog walkers choosing busier streets, parents lingering a little longer at the edge of the playground instead of sitting on benches with their backs turned. The murders had introduced a new question into ordinary routines, a quiet, persistent thought that followed people as they moved through familiar spaces. If someone could kill like this, with such calm and confidence, and leave behind nothing but a strange walk on a grainy screen, then what else, people wondered, could be hiding in plain sight? And as the investigation pressed forward, that question would only grow louder, complicated by false leads, shifting theories, and the uncomfortable realization that the most obvious clue in the case might also be the most misleading. As the initial shock began to settle, the investigation entered its most dangerous phase, the point at which certainty gave way to speculation and pressure began to mount from every direction at once. Detectives were no longer just trying to understand what had happened. They were racing against the fear that whoever had done this might strike again, emboldened by the fact that 2 executions had already passed without consequence. The first working theory was the most obvious one. The victims knew each other, or at least shared a common thread that would explain why they were killed in such a similar fashion. Investigators mapped their lives side by side, overlaying timelines, addresses, workplaces, and social circles, searching for overlap where none seemed to exist. They worked different jobs, lived in different neighborhoods, and, on the surface, moved through entirely separate worlds. There were no shared phone numbers, no mutual contacts, no social media connections that raised immediate alarms. When that theory stalled, attention shifted to organized crime and gang-related activity, despite the unusual locations and lack of accompanying violence. Execution-style killings often pointed in that direction, and Chicago's history made it impossible to ignore. Detectives quietly explored whether the murders could have been sanctioned hits, messages sent within criminal networks, carried out with discipline and restraint. But the deeper they looked, the less it fit. No known organizations claimed responsibility, no intelligence suggested an ongoing dispute, and the parks themselves made little sense as locations for professional hits meant to send a message. Then came the footage. As the duck walk video circulated more widely, tips flooded in from across the city and beyond. People called in claiming to recognize the walk as belonging to a neighbor, a coworker, an ex-boyfriend, a man they passed every morning on the train platform. Some tips were earnest, others fueled by paranoia, but all of them demanded time, follow-ups, and resources. Detectives reviewed hours of additional surveillance footage, hoping to catch the suspect entering a vehicle, removing a jacket, or doing anything that might narrow the field, but the man seemed to dissolve into the city with almost supernatural efficiency. One particularly compelling lead emerged when a tipster suggested the walk resembled that of someone with a specific orthopedic condition, possibly the result of an old injury or corrective surgery. Medical experts were consulted. Hospitals and clinics were quietly asked to flag patients who matched certain criteria. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the killer's most distinctive trait might finally become his undoing. It went nowhere. Another theory proposed that the walk was not physical at all, but psychological, an intentional affectation adopted to confuse investigators or draw attention away from more identifying details. Some believe the killer was taunting the public, leaving behind a visual signature he knew would be endlessly dissected, debated, and misunderstood. The idea was unsettling, because it suggested a level of self-awareness and control that pushed the case closer to something far darker than a simple double homicide. As pressure grew, so did mistakes. An early person of interest, a man with a prior violent record who lived near one of the parks, was quietly investigated after a neighbor claimed his walk looked similar enough to the footage. Rumors spread quickly, faster than facts ever could, and for a brief period, his name circulated in online forums and comment sections as a likely suspect. When detectives ultimately ruled him out, citing clear alibis and a lack of physical evidence, the damage was already done. It was a reminder of how easily fear could attach itself to the wrong person when answers refused to appear. Inside the department, frustration simmered. This was not a case lacking evidence, but one drowning in ambiguous evidence, clues that felt meaningful but refused to resolve into anything solid. The duck walk, once seen as a breakthrough, began to feel like a trap, pulling attention towards speculation rather than substance. Every time investigators thought they were close, the trail thinned, dissolved, or turned back on itself. And looming over everything was the question no one wanted to voice out loud. What if there were more victims? Patrols were increased around parks. Officers were told to be alert during early morning hours. Detectives watched the calendar, counting days, then weeks, waiting for a third crime that never came, at least not in the same way. The absence of escalation was as confusing as the murders themselves, raising the possibility that the killer had achieved whatever goal he had set, or that something, somewhere, had gone wrong. By the time the investigation reached this stage, the case was no longer just about identifying a suspect. It had become a maze of theories, false confidence, and discarded certainties, where every apparent lead seemed to point in multiple directions at once. The duck walk killer was no longer just a man caught on camera, but a symbol of how easily clarity could slip through the cracks, even in an age obsessed with seeing everything. And as the case edged closer to its most painful realization, the city would be forced to confront a truth that true crime stories often save for the end. Sometimes, despite all the footage, all the effort, and all the noise, justice does not arrive at all. By the time the investigation reached its second year, the case had begun to change in a way that was difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. It was no longer driven by momentum or urgency, but by inertia, kept alive less by new discoveries and more by the quiet refusal of the victims' families and a handful of detectives to let it die completely. The duck walk killer had not struck again, at least not in any pattern that could be conclusively linked to the park executions, and that absence, instead of bringing relief, created a new and deeply unsettling uncertainty. The central hope of the case, the piece of evidence that had once seemed almost too perfect to ignore, slowly revealed itself as its greatest failure. The footage. Investigators had initially believed that the suspect's unusual gait would be the key, the one feature that could not be easily hidden or changed, something that would follow him no matter how carefully he tried to disappear. But over time, the reality became more complicated. Medical consultants could not agree on whether the walk was caused by injury, neurological condition, habit, or conscious exaggeration. Each explanation carried different implications, and none of them could be proven. What had once seemed like a fingerprint began to look more like a Rorschach test, interpreted differently by everyone who saw it. As months passed, the quality of the footage itself became a liability. Defense attorneys consulted unofficially by the department pointed out what investigators already feared. Even if a suspect were identified, the video alone would be unlikely to survive the scrutiny of a courtroom. The face was never clearly visible. The clothing was generic. The walk, while distinctive, could be argued away as coincidence or misinterpretation. In a legal system built on certainty beyond reasonable doubt, the duck walk was not enough. Behind closed doors, the case began to be quietly downgraded. Detectives were reassigned. Resources were shifted to more active investigations. Leads that once would have triggered immediate follow-up were now placed into growing digital folders, tagged, categorized, and postponed. No one announced that the case was going cold, because that word carried a finality no one was willing to admit. But functionally, that was exactly what was happening. For the families of the victims, this was the moment when the second trauma began. They had endured the shock of sudden loss, the surreal experience of seeing their loved ones reduced to blurred images and police statements, and the exhausting cycle of hope and disappointment that accompanied each new development. Now they were forced to confront something even harder to accept, the possibility that there would be no arrest, no trial, no moment when the person responsible would be publicly named and held accountable. One family member would later describe it as living with an open question instead of a wound, something that never healed because it never closed. Every time the footage resurfaced online, every time a true crime forum revisited the case, the pain was reactivated, paired with the same haunting image of a man walking away, untouched and unidentified. Public interest followed a predictable but painful arc. Local coverage dwindled. Updates became smaller, buried lower on news websites, framed not as breaking developments, but as anniversaries, reminders of something unresolved. National outlets, which had briefly flirted with the story, moved on entirely, drawn to cases with clearer villains and more dramatic payoffs. The Duck Walk killer remained trapped in a regional limbo, too strange to forget, but too quiet to sustain outrage. And then came the most sobering realization of all. There was no dramatic twist in the traditional sense, no shocking arrest or courtroom reversal. The twist was absence. The failure was procedural, systemic, and deeply human. It lay in the uncomfortable truth that even with witnesses, even with video, even with public pressure, the system could still fail to produce justice when evidence lived in the gray spaces between suspicion and proof. Some detectives would later admit, off the record, that they believed the killer had either left the city or blended back into a routine so ordinary that no one thought to look twice. Others suspected that the murders were deeply personal, that the motive was so specific and so contained that it burned out after achieving its purpose, leaving no reason to repeat the act. None of these theories could be confirmed, and so they existed only as quiet, unresolved possibilities. The case files remained open, technically speaking, but they were no longer active in any meaningful sense. The Duck Walk killer had not been caught, not because he was smarter than everyone else, but because the gap between what was seen and what could be proven proved impossible to bridge. And in that gap, justice slipped away. What remained was a city that had briefly glimpsed the limits of its own surveillance, a pair of families left without answers, and a case that refused to provide the catharsis people expect from stories about crime. The ending, such as it was, offered no closure, only the lingering discomfort of knowing that sometimes the most unsettling outcomes are not marked by dramatic failure, but by quiet, bureaucratic surrender. And yet, even in that silence, the story was not truly over. Because unresolved cases have a way of echoing forward, shaping policy, fear, and memory long after the last detective steps away. That echo is where this story ultimately leads. Long after the last patrol car stopped circling those parks and the case files were pushed deeper into the digital archives, the Duck Walk murders continued to exert a quiet influence on Chicago in ways that were subtle, indirect, and impossible to fully measure. This was not a story that ended with a name etched into a court record or a sentence handed down by a judge. Instead, it lingered in policy meetings, community conversations, and the uneasy relationship between the public and the technology they had once trusted so completely. In the months following the murders, city officials pointed to the case when discussing the expansion of surveillance infrastructure, citing it as proof that cameras were essential, even if imperfect. More cameras were installed. Coverage maps grew denser. Blind spots were reduced. And yet, for many residents, the Duck Walk killer had already exposed an uncomfortable truth. Visibility was not the same as accountability. You could be seen without being known, recorded without being stopped, identified without being named. The illusion of safety, once cracked, was difficult to restore. For criminologists and law enforcement professionals, the case became a quiet teaching tool. It was referenced in training sessions and academic discussions as an example of evidentiary ambiguity, a reminder that compelling footage could still fail to meet the burden of proof. The duck walk itself was dissected endlessly, not because it solved anything, but because it demonstrated how easily human perception could be misled. What felt distinctive and unforgettable to the public proved frustratingly fragile under legal scrutiny. The parks, too, carried the memory forward. Nothing marked the exact spots where the men had been killed. No plaques, no memorial benches, no official acknowledgement beyond the initial police reports. But memory does not require signage to persist. Locals spoke about the murders in lowered voices, often vaguely, referring to them as that thing that happened a few years back, as if naming it too clearly might invite it back. New residents moved in unaware of the history beneath their feet, while longtime neighbors carried it quietly, an invisible layer beneath ordinary routines. Online, the case refused to disappear entirely. Every few years, the footage resurfaced, shared anew by true crime communities, framed as a mystery that deserved more attention than it ever received. Comment sections filled with fresh speculation, slowed-down clips, and armchair diagnoses, each generation of viewers convinced they might see something everyone else had missed. The duck walk killer became less a person and more a symbol, representing the category of crimes that sit just beyond resolution, close enough to haunt, too far to solve. For the families, time did not bring closure, only distance. Grief settled into a permanent background presence, reshaped by anniversaries, unanswered questions, and the knowledge that the person responsible had never been forced to reckon with what he had done. Their loved ones were remembered not only for who they were, but for the way their deaths exposed the limits of the systems meant to protect them. And perhaps that is why this story still matters. Because it challenges the comforting narrative that progress guarantees justice, that better cameras and more data inevitably lead to answers. The duck walk killer showed how easily certainty could unravel, how a case could be simultaneously documented and unresolved, and how violence could pass through public space without leaving behind anything solid enough to hold on to. Somewhere, perhaps, the man with the strange walk still moves through crowds unnoticed, his gait softened by time, injury, or age, indistinguishable now from thousands of others. Or perhaps he is gone, carried off by circumstances unrelated to the crimes that briefly brought him into the frame. The truth is unknown, and that uncertainty is the final, enduring legacy of the case. Not a solved mystery, not a cautionary tale neatly wrapped in justice, but a reminder that sometimes the most disturbing stories are the ones that end not with answers, but with silence, and the knowledge that the camera kept rolling, even as the truth slipped out of view. As the public conversation slowly shifted away from speculation and toward forgetting, the victims themselves risked becoming secondary characters in their own story, reduced to crime scene descriptions and blurred timelines rather than remembered as full human beings whose lives had extended far beyond the final moments caught in police reports. This quiet erasure was never intentional, but it was a consequence of how unresolved cases tend to be discussed, with attention fixed on the mystery rather than the people at its center. The first victim had lived a life that, by all outward measures, appeared unremarkable in the way most lives are unremarkable. Steady work, familiar routines, a small circle of people who knew him well enough to notice his habits and absences. He was not someone who attracted attention, not someone whose name would have ever appeared in a headline under normal circumstances. Friends described him as predictable in a comforting way, the kind of person who showed up when expected and left without drama, whose life moved forward quietly, without sharp edges. That predictability made his death harder to understand. Investigators searched for hidden conflicts, unresolved disputes, or secret entanglements that might explain why someone would take the time to execute him so deliberately. They found none that rose above the level of ordinary human friction. No recent threats, no obvious enemies, nothing that could easily justify the level of intent suggested by the crime scene. The idea that he might have been targeted for reasons known only to the killer became one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. The second victim's life followed a different trajectory, but it ended in the same silence. He moved through the city with a sense of purpose shaped by responsibilities that extended beyond himself, balancing work, personal obligations, and long-term plans that would never be realized. Those who knew him spoke about his future in the past tense after his death, listing what he had been building toward rather than what he had achieved, as if the loss was not only of a person, but of a direction, a path abruptly cut off. Despite the differences in their lives, the similarities in their deaths forced an unwanted connection between them, one neither man had chosen and neither family welcomed. They were bound together not by shared history, but by the method and timing of their execution, transformed into paired data points in an investigation that struggled to explain why either had been singled out at all. For detectives, revisiting the victims' lives became both necessary and painful. As leads dried up elsewhere, they returned again and again to the possibility that the answers were buried in details already examined, something overlooked not because it was invisible, but because it seemed too ordinary to matter. Phone records were rechecked. Old acquaintances were re-interviewed. Seemingly insignificant interactions were reconsidered through the lens of violence. Each pass through the material carried the same hope, that somewhere, hidden in plain sight, was the reason two men had been forced into the same ending. But the deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became that the victims' lives resisted the narrative the crime seemed to demand. There was no obvious shared secret, no dramatic double life waiting to be uncovered, no single revelation that could suddenly make the murders make sense. Instead, there was only the uncomfortable possibility that the motive was either intensely personal or profoundly opaque, rooted in a perspective no one else had access to. For the families, this phase of the investigation was particularly cruel. They were asked to relive memories, to re-examine relationships, to consider the possibility that something dangerous had existed just beyond their awareness. Each interview carried an unspoken implication, a suggestion that the answer might lie uncomfortably close to home. And when nothing emerged, the absence of explanation became another burden to carry, layered on top of grief. In the broader public imagination, the Duck Walk killer remained a figure defined by movement, by the eerie rhythm of his steps captured on video. But for those closest to the case, the story was increasingly shaped by stillness. Lives stopped, conversations unfinished, futures frozen at a point no one had chosen. And as the investigation continued to circle without resolution, one truth became harder to ignore. Whatever the motive had been, it had not announced itself. It had left no manifesto, no message, no clear signal to explain why these men were chosen. The violence spoke only through its precision, and in doing so, it denied everyone left behind the one thing they wanted most: an explanation. The absence of that explanation would soon push the case in an even darker direction, where theories grew more speculative, and the line between evidence and assumption became dangerously thin. When evidence stops producing answers, theories begin to multiply, and in the Duck Walk case, they did so with a persistence that outlived official updates and press conferences. What began as informed speculation among investigators slowly bled into public imagination, where the absence of facts created space for narratives that were sometimes plausible, sometimes fantastical, and often impossible to disprove. One of the earliest theories to gain traction was that the murders were connected by something deliberately hidden, a private dispute or transaction that never appeared in records because it was never meant to. Detectives considered the possibility of an informal economy operating beneath the surface of ordinary life, favors exchanged quietly, debts owed without paperwork, relationships that left no digital trace. In this version of events, the parks were not random locations, but neutral ground, chosen because they offered anonymity and a clean exit. The problem was that this theory relied almost entirely on absence. There was no concrete proof of such dealings, only the sense that the crimes felt too controlled to be spontaneous. Investigators found themselves arguing against their own instincts, forced to admit that what felt deliberate could not automatically be translated into what could be demonstrated. Another theory pushed the case in a far more disturbing direction. Some believe the duck walk killer was not motivated by the victims at all, but by the act itself, that the men were chosen not for who they were, but for when and where they happened to be vulnerable. This interpretation reframed the executions not as messages or resolutions, but as rehearsals, expressions of power carried out with methodical restraint. Supporters of this theory pointed to the identical method, the controlled timing, and the lack of emotional residue at the scenes as indicators of someone practicing a ritual rather than settling a score. This idea unsettled investigators deeply, because it suggested that the absence of further killings was not reassurance, but coincidence. Online communities took this speculation even further, analyzing the duck walk footage frame by frame, mapping the suspect's stride, posture, and speed, comparing it to known cases, medical conditions, and even fictional killers. Some argued the walk indicated a neurological disorder. Others insisted it reflected military or law enforcement training, a stance adopted under stress. A few went so far as to suggest the gait was exaggerated on purpose, a conscious performance meant to embed itself in public memory. With each new interpretation, the figure in the video seemed to shift, becoming less human and more symbolic. Former detectives occasionally weighed in through interviews and podcasts, careful with their words but honest about the frustration. Several acknowledged that the case haunted them not because of what it revealed, but because of what it withheld. The footage showed movement without context, action without explanation, and that imbalance gnawed at the investigative process. One retired officer described it as watching the answer walk right past you, knowing you can't stop it. As the years passed, the theories began to reflect broader anxieties rather than specific facts. Some framed the case as a failure of urban surveillance, others as proof that violence could still exist outside predictive models and algorithms. The duck walk killer became a blank canvas onto which people projected fears about anonymity, control, and the limits of modern policing. Yet, for all the noise, one reality remained unchanged. None of the theories brought the case closer to resolution. They filled time. They generated discussion. They kept the story alive in fragments and echoes. But they did not produce names, arrests, or evidence strong enough to move the case forward. The more the mystery was discussed, the more it seemed to harden into something permanent, a question mark embedded in the city's history. And quietly, almost without notice, the investigation crossed a psychological threshold. It was no longer driven by the expectation of discovery, but by the responsibility of preservation, of ensuring that if an answer ever did appear, there would still be someone left who remembered why it mattered. Because unresolved cases do not simply fade away. They wait. And waiting, as this story would continue to show, can be its own form of consequence. Over time, the image of the duck walk killer began to detach itself from the original crime scenes and take on a life of its own, evolving from a piece of evidentiary footage into something closer to urban legend. The walk, once analyzed with forensic seriousness, slowly drifted into the realm of symbolism, shorthand for a fear that could not be named and a threat that could not be located. In Chicago, stories began to circulate the way they often do when official answers run out. People claimed to have seen a man with the same strange gait on late-night platforms, in parking garages, or crossing empty streets just before dawn. Most of these sightings were vague, impossible to verify, and almost certainly unrelated, but they followed a familiar pattern. Someone noticed a walk that felt wrong, and memory filled in the rest. The footage had trained the public eye, turning an ordinary human variation into a potential warning sign. This was one of the case's quietest but most damaging consequences. The duck walk stopped being evidence and started becoming a lens through which people interpreted strangers. Men with injuries, disabilities, or simply unusual posture found themselves stared at longer, watched more carefully, sometimes even reported. None of this was coordinated or malicious, but it revealed how quickly fear could reshape perception, how a single unresolved image could ripple outward and distort everyday interactions. For law enforcement, this shift was deeply frustrating. The walk had once felt like a gift, a rare, visually distinctive clue in a city saturated with anonymity. Now it had become diluted, its power weakened by overexposure and misapplication. Every new sighting pulled attention away from the original footage and pushed the case further into abstraction. Detectives worried that if the killer were ever identified, the walk itself might no longer feel meaningful enough to convince a jury, buried beneath years of speculation and false association. Yet the myth persisted because it filled a vacuum. In the absence of a face or a name, the walk became the killer's identity. It was something people could point to, imitate, joke about uncomfortably, or fear in silence. Late-night hosts referenced it briefly when discussing unsolved crimes. Online creators recreated it in reenactments, careful to avoid caricature but unable to escape the eerie effect of seeing it performed again and again. Each repetition stripped the original footage of context, while simultaneously reinforcing its emotional power. What was often forgotten was how brief the actual evidence was, just seconds of grainy movement, extracted from hours of nothing at all. The myth expanded far beyond the reality, until the duck walk killer existed less as a person and more as a shadow, a figure defined entirely by motion without motive. For the families, this transformation was painful to watch. Their loss had been converted into a symbol, their loved ones' deaths reduced to the origin story of a nickname that felt flippant despite its dark undertones. Some refused to watch the footage ever again, while others studied it obsessively, hoping that repetition might yield clarity where investigation had failed. Neither approach brought relief. And still, somewhere beneath the layers of myth and misinterpretation, the original question remained unanswered. Who was the man in the video? As years passed, the city itself changed. Neighborhoods evolved, buildings were renovated or torn down, and the parks where the murders occurred continued to absorb new memories that slowly crowded out the old. Children played where evidence markers had once stood. Dogs chased balls across ground that had once been treated as sacred by investigators. But the walk endured. It lingered in collective memory because it represented something deeply unsettling. The idea that a person could reveal just enough of themselves to be unforgettable and yet remain entirely unknown. That a crime could be both documented and unsolved. That movement alone could become a legacy. And as the case slipped further into history, one final question began to emerge, quieter than the rest, but far more troubling. What if the duck walk killer had never intended to be caught at all? Not because he was hiding, but because he understood something everyone else did not. That sometimes, leaving behind an image is more powerful than leaving behind an answer. Even the most meticulous investigations are vulnerable to human error, and in the case of the duck walk killer, these errors quietly shaped the outcome in ways that would haunt the Chicago Police Department for years. At first, mistakes were small, a mislabeled piece of footage here, a late follow-up on a credible tip there. But as the investigation stretched on, the cumulative weight of these oversights began to reveal themselves not as isolated lapses, but as structural weaknesses in a system unprepared for a case so unusual. One early misstep involved a key piece of surveillance footage from a nearby convenience store. It had captured the suspect leaving the vicinity of the first park approximately 10 minutes after the estimated time of death, his hands clearly visible and empty, yet a technical glitch caused the clip to be recorded at an incorrect timestamp. By the time detectives realized the discrepancy, several critical leads had already been deprioritized, and the trail cooled. Investigators would later lament that those 10 minutes might have contained the single piece of evidence needed to identify the man. Another missed opportunity arose from reliance on eyewitness accounts. Several joggers reported seeing someone matching the suspect's description near the second park on the morning of the second murder, yet these statements were inconsistently logged, spread across multiple precincts, and in some cases, lost in the shuffle of digital databases. By the time they were cross-referenced, details had begun to conflict, leaving detectives with accounts so vague that they could neither confirm nor deny the suspect's movements. The frustration was palpable. The one element of human observation that could have anchored the investigation instead became a source of confusion. Missteps were not limited to logistics. Internal debates about how to classify the murders slowed progress considerably. Should they be treated as gang-related, despite a lack of evidence? Were they the product of a personal vendetta, or the work of someone who killed simply to assert dominance? Each internal disagreement consumed precious time and resources, and the lack of consensus diluted the focus necessary to pursue more promising leads. Even the most obvious clue, the killer's walk, was mishandled. Early on, analysts considered consulting gait specialists, biomechanics experts, or rehabilitation therapists who might have recognized a distinctive pattern tied to medical history or training. But budgetary constraints, competing priorities, and a subtle disbelief that a walk could truly be meaningful led to the idea being shelved. By the time the theory was revisited, the window for actionable insight had largely closed. These missteps compounded, and the investigation began to feel like a chase in which every forward step triggered new obstacles. Evidence that could have been decisive was diluted, opportunities evaporated, and confidence waned. What remained was footage, speculation, and a growing sense that the city had been confronted with a puzzle too complex to solve with the tools at hand. Public pressure only intensified the weight on the detectives. Citizens demanded answers, media outlets sought statements, and online communities criticized missteps in real time, turning every small failure into a perceived catastrophe. In the end, the investigation was caught between two truths: the undeniable reality of the evidence and the limitations of those tasked with interpreting it. The Duck Walk killer remained at large, proof that even a case meticulously documented from start to finish could still slip through human hands. And so, in these missed opportunities and procedural miscalculations, the story of the Duck Walk killer became as much about the failures of those trying to stop him as it was about the man himself. A haunting reminder that crime is not only a test of morality, but a test of systems, judgment, and timing, and that even the smallest lapse can tilt the scales irreversibly. As the months stretched into years, the Duck Walk killer case became as much a psychological puzzle as a criminal investigation. With no arrest, no confession, and only fleeting, grainy footage to study, law enforcement turned inward, relying on behavioral profiling, witness patterns, and historical precedent to construct a portrait of the man who had moved through Chicago with such calculated indifference. Profilers suggested that the killer was likely someone meticulous, methodical, and patient, traits that had allowed him to carry out 2 executions in the span of 36 hours without leaving behind physical evidence that could identify him. His duck-like gait, initially seen as a quirky anomaly, became a defining clue in the minds of investigators, hinting at either a lifelong physical condition or a consciously cultivated behavior meant to unsettle anyone who observed it. Theories emerged that the walk was an intentional psychological tool, an almost theatrical signature meant to imprint itself on witnesses and cameras alike, ensuring that even anonymity carried a signature of terror. For the public, the fascination grew in ways that defied logic. True crime forums dissected the footage frame by frame, debating whether the gait revealed a limp, an old injury, or some form of neurological condition. Every angle, every step, every shadow in the grainy footage was scrutinized, discussed, and reinterpreted. Armchair detectives proposed theories that ranged from military training to ritualistic behavior. Video compilations and reenactments proliferated online, cementing the killer's duck-like walk as a symbol of eerie precision and uncatchable menace. The community's obsession, however, was double-edged. On one hand, it kept attention on the case and occasionally produced new tips, yet on the other, it distorted reality. False sightings surged, some reported by people who genuinely believed they had glimpsed him, others fabricated or misremembered, further muddying the investigative waters. Social media amplified these reports, spreading anxiety through neighborhoods and keeping the specter of the killer alive long after the murders had faded from the front pages. This public fixation had a subtle psychological effect on Chicago itself. People altered their routines, avoided parks during early mornings, and grew hyper-aware of movement in public spaces. The Duck Walk became not only a memory of violence, but a measure of fear, its very rhythm embedded in the collective psyche of those who lived near the crime scenes. Residents began walking faster when alone, checking the shadows more closely, and casting sideways glances at strangers, as if the killer could reappear at any moment, indistinguishable from the crowds of the city. Law enforcement recognized the danger of this duality. While public attention could aid the investigation by producing tips, it also encouraged misinformation and false leads, sometimes even undermining serious leads with chatter and hysteria. The case became an ongoing lesson in the interplay between perception and evidence, showing how a single, inexplicable trait, like a distinctive walk, could dominate the narrative more than any physical clue or witness account. And yet, amid the obsession, a chilling clarity remained. The duck walk killer had achieved what few criminals ever manage. He had transformed his own movement into mythology, an enduring signature that terrified, fascinated, and eluded capture simultaneously. The psychological profile, as detailed as it could be without direct evidence, suggested a man who understood control, not just over his victims, but over the way the world remembered him. The killer had not merely committed murder. He had orchestrated a performance, and the city, with its cameras, social media, and endless speculation, had unwittingly become part of it. The duck walk, once just a peculiar gait caught on a grainy screen, had become a symbol of enduring mystery and psychological manipulation, a step-by-step reminder that sometimes the most unsettling killers leave behind not blood or fingerprints, but an idea, a movement that will never be fully forgotten. Even in the absence of new murders, the duck walk killer continued to haunt the city in ways that were almost spectral, through near misses, fleeting glimpses, and the occasional report from a terrified witness. These moments never produced arrests, but they injected the investigation with renewed urgency and reminded everyone that the killer's shadow still lingered. One early morning, a commuter walking along a quiet stretch near the second park noticed a figure moving with an unmistakably odd gait. The man paused momentarily at a streetlight, glanced over his shoulder, and continued in a slow, deliberate waddle that sent a shiver down the witness's spine. By the time police arrived, there was no one there. The description matched the duck walk footage exactly, from the bent knees to the outward angled feet, yet no other evidence remained. The sighting, though brief, confirmed what many already feared. The killer could emerge anywhere and leave no trace, slipping into the city as though it were designed for him alone. Other reports were even more unnerving. Residents described seeing a man loitering near playgrounds or jogging paths in the hours before dawn, always moving with the same unnatural rhythm. In one particularly unnerving account, a cyclist passed a figure who seemed to study them silently before continuing along a secluded trail. When the cyclist returned later, police found that the man had vanished entirely, leaving only the faintest imprint of footsteps in the damp grass. These moments, though anecdotal, were treated with seriousness by detectives who understood that even fleeting encounters could offer clues, or, at the very least, validate patterns in the killer's behavior. Yet not all near misses were purely observational. On a chilly evening months after the murders, a small-time thief inadvertently stumbled into the suspect during what appeared to be a reconnaissance of the first park. The man's movement was deliberate, almost theatrical, and he seemed to anticipate the observer's attention without reacting. The thief's description, later shared with police, reinforced the unnerving details of the original footage, the same duck-like walk, a calm pace, and an aura of control that made ordinary witnesses feel profoundly unsettled. No physical evidence was left behind, and the encounter yielded nothing that could help identify him, yet it further cemented the killer's legend in the minds of those who heard about it. Even those closest to the investigation could not escape the psychological impact of these near misses. Detectives often spoke of walking on eggshells in parks, feeling the tension in empty spaces, and scrutinizing every passerby for a hint of that unmistakable gait. The human brain, trained to recognize patterns, began to see the duck walk everywhere, in late-night joggers, delivery workers, and even strangers on public transportation. The killer had achieved an unsettling ubiquity, turning ordinary city movement into a potential threat. The chilling reality was that every report, true or mistaken, reinforced a central truth. The duck walk killer had mastered the art of disappearing while remaining profoundly present. His presence was felt not through violence alone, but through anticipation, fear, and the haunting possibility of being watched by someone who could strike without warning. For the families of the victims, these near misses were torture. Each report reminded them that the person responsible was still at large, still moving freely through the same streets where their loved ones had been executed. There was no comfort in time passing, no assurance that the killer had left the city or grown old. Every shadow and every unusual gait became a question, a possibility, a lingering nightmare. And for the city, it became a collective tension, a quiet paranoia that threaded through daily life. People walked faster in the early hours, avoided isolated paths, and watched each other more closely, not out of suspicion of ordinary citizens, but because somewhere in Chicago, a man with a duck-like gait continued to move through public spaces, untouchable and untamed, leaving only fear and questions behind. As the years passed, the Chicago Police Department turned to technology in ways that would have seemed almost science fiction in 2018, hoping that new tools could finally bridge the gap between observation and identification. Video enhancement software, facial recognition algorithms, AI-assisted gait analysis, and cross-referencing of citywide surveillance footage became the cornerstone of renewed efforts to catch the duck walk killer. Yet, even with the most advanced resources at their disposal, investigators were confronted with a frustrating reality. The man on camera had disappeared into a city brimming with millions of faces, millions of movements, and millions of fleeting opportunities to be lost among the crowd. The grainy footage of the original murders was reprocessed multiple times, each iteration attempting to clarify the suspect's posture, stride, and silhouette. Specialists ran simulations, comparing the gait against databases of known offenders, attempting to calculate height, weight, and physical limitations from angles and shadows. They examined subtle details, the swing of his arms, the outward rotation of his knees, even the cadence of his steps. Every algorithm produced possibilities, but no definitive answers. The more the footage was scrutinized, the more elusive certainty became. In tandem, detectives revisited old witness statements and tip lines, feeding details into predictive models designed to cross-reference behavior, social patterns, and geographic presence. They combed through public records, looking for individuals who might match the profile constructed over years of behavioral analysis. Neighborhoods were mapped and remapped, timelines recalculated. Every clue, no matter how minor, was fed into the system, yet each run of the data produced only potentialities, never confirmations. Public interest resurfaced intermittently whenever the city released enhanced images or AI reconstructions of the walk. News outlets highlighted these efforts as a sign that modern technology could finally solve what once seemed unsolvable. Social media buzzed with speculation, new theories, and renewed fascination, but the outcome remained unchanged. No arrest. No face ever clearly emerged from the computational haze. Even after years of technological advances, the duck walk killer remained a master of disappearance. It became increasingly clear that this man had either anticipated such scrutiny or, perhaps more likely, understood instinctively how to exploit the chaos of urban life. The combination of the city's vast, anonymous population and his unremarkable appearance had allowed him to exploit one of the oldest truths about modern surveillance. Visibility does not guarantee capture. The attempts at technological breakthroughs underscored an uncomfortable lesson. High-definition cameras, sophisticated algorithms, and advanced analytical tools could do much, but they could not account for human unpredictability, for chance encounters, or for the cunning of someone who had already demonstrated patience, calculation, and control. Each failed attempt left detectives grappling with the gap between what was possible in theory and what could actually be accomplished in practice. The case also revealed an ironic truth about progress. Technology had been assumed to be infallible, a silver bullet for crime in a digital age. Yet, in this instance, it illuminated only the limitations of human expectation. The duck walk killer had not left fingerprints, DNA, or a single traceable digital footprint. He had left a walk, and the city's most powerful tools could not translate it into justice. And so the investigation, though reinvigorated by new technology, remained stalled, a testament to both the ingenuity of the killer and the enduring complexity of human movement and behavior. The duck walk was no longer just a video anomaly. It had become a puzzle, a benchmark against which even the most advanced modern forensic tools failed, a reminder that even in an era of supposed omnipresence, a person determined to remain unseen could still vanish completely. Even though no arrest was ever made, the duck walk killer case left a lasting imprint on Chicago's legal and media landscape, reshaping the way law enforcement, journalists, and the public thought about unsolved crimes. For prosecutors, it became a cautionary tale about relying on circumstantial evidence and the limits of what video footage can prove in court. In an era where cameras lined streets, storefronts, and public spaces, the assumption had been that crimes would leave a permanent trace. The duck walk killer defied that assumption entirely. Legal experts pointed out early on that the footage, while compelling to viewers, would have been insufficient to convict anyone. The suspect's face was obscured, there was no DNA, no weapon recovered, no fingerprints, nothing linking a person definitively to the act. It was a reminder that even with the most dramatic visual evidence, the justice system demands more than speculation. The case became a reference point in law enforcement circles, discussed in training programs as an example of what some termed evidentiary illusion, when an image is so memorable that it feels like proof, even when it is not. The media, meanwhile, grappled with how to cover a case that refused resolution. Local outlets had initially devoted significant airtime, looping the grainy footage, interviewing witnesses, and consulting experts in criminology and body language. Yet as months passed without a suspect, the tone shifted. Headlines became less about the killings themselves and more about the mystery, the haunting footage, and the duck walk as a cultural touchstone. National coverage, which had initially been minimal, mostly faded, leaving the case largely in regional memory, a story that generated fascination without the closure that sustains long-term attention. Despite the media's retreat, public fascination persisted. True crime podcasts revisited the footage, exploring theories about motive, psychological profile, and the uncanny nature of the walk. Online forums dissected every frame, speculating about potential suspects, injuries, or military training. The duck walk killer became a symbol, almost a meme, in a city that had experienced trauma but lacked answers. The nickname itself carried a grim resonance, turning a human life and two senseless murders into a story defined more by spectacle than by substance. Legally, the absence of arrests left families in a state of limbo. Civil suits were impossible, restraining orders meaningless, and questions about police procedure were left unanswered. Even internal reviews offered little solace. Investigators acknowledged missteps and technological limitations, but could offer no definitive pathway to closure. For the victims' relatives, the media coverage was a double-edged sword. It reminded the public of the murders, keeping their loved ones' stories alive. Yet it also reduced the individuals to eerie footage and speculation, a bitter reminder of how the case defied resolution. The aftermath also rippled outward into policy discussions. Law enforcement agencies reconsidered the deployment of resources in unsolved cases, balancing public pressure against operational limitations. Surveillance procedures, evidence preservation, and digital storage became points of debate. The duck walk killer was repeatedly cited as an example of how even modern infrastructure could fail, not because it was flawed in isolation, but because human behavior, city complexity, and chance can render technology insufficient. In the end, the duck walk killer case reshaped the conversation without delivering the answers anyone wanted. Courts, media, and public opinion were all forced to contend with the uncomfortable reality that some crimes, no matter how well documented or sensational, resist closure. The legacy of the case was not found in justice served, but in the questions it raised, the fear it instilled, and the enduring image of a man walking away from murder in a way no one could forget, and no one could definitively stop. Even years after the murders, the duck walk killer remained an enigma, a case that refused to be neatly categorized or explained. Every attempt at closure seemed to generate more questions than answers, leaving behind a web of mysteries that continue to haunt both investigators and the public imagination. One of the most persistent questions was about the choice of victims. Despite extensive profiling and analysis, no clear connection ever emerged between the two men. They came from different neighborhoods, held different jobs, and had no known personal or professional ties. Some theorists suggested that the killings were opportunistic, chosen not for who the men were, but for when and where they could be accessed. Others argued that the motive was deeply personal, perhaps tied to grudges invisible to anyone outside the killer's mind. The truth remained elusive, leaving space for speculation, fear, and the haunting notion that anyone could have been next. Another enduring mystery was the killer's unusual gait itself. Was it the result of a physical condition, an old injury, or deliberate affectation designed to unnerve observers and confound investigators? Specialists consulted throughout the case could never reach a consensus. The walk had become a symbol of the killer's identity, yet it offered no concrete clues that could anchor an investigation. Every re-examination of the footage revealed only more uncertainty, as the shadows and angles of the grainy videos seemed to mask as much as they revealed. The public's fascination with the case added another layer of complexity. Online forums thrived on hypothetical connections, from theories of organized crime to obscure personal vendettas. Some speculated the killer had military or law enforcement training, while others argued he was a calculating loner who had studied prior murders to perfect his technique. Each theory, while compelling in isolation, contradicted another, leaving no unifying narrative. And yet, the persistence of these theories ensured that the case remained alive, circulating through collective memory even in the absence of new evidence. There were also chilling reports that blurred the line between fact and folklore. Witnesses occasionally came forward claiming near encounters with a man who moved in that distinctive way, walking through alleys, parks, or transit stations. While none of these sightings could be confirmed, they reinforced the sense that the Duck Walk killer could reappear at any time, moving among the population unnoticed, blending into the city with a patience and subtlety that no surveillance system could counter. The idea of his continued presence kept anxiety alive, a shadow threading through daily life in Chicago. And yet, amid these unresolved questions, a more profound mystery persisted: the human impulse to understand and categorize. Investigators, journalists, and armchair detectives alike wrestled with the need for closure that the Duck Walk killer would never provide. Every speculation, every hypothesis, and every reconstruction was a small rebellion against the incomprehensible randomness of his choices. The case had become less about solving the murders and more about confronting the uncomfortable reality that some crimes resist interpretation, that some perpetrators leave behind a narrative of absence rather than presence. In this way, the Duck Walk killer transcended the immediate facts of the case. He became a study in the limits of observation, the fragility of certainty, and the persistent human need to find meaning even when none is forthcoming. The murders were never explained, the motives never clarified, and the man himself remained unlocated. And perhaps that was the most unsettling part of all. The case had no ending, no tidy resolution, only a series of questions that continue to echo through the streets, the parks, and the collective imagination of the city. Years have passed since the Duck Walk killer first appeared on grainy footage in Chicago, yet the case continues to ripple through the city in ways both tangible and intangible. The murders, though few in number, left a mark far greater than their immediate tragedy might suggest, transforming not only the lives of the victims' families, but also the collective consciousness of the neighborhoods, the culture of policing, and even the folklore of the city itself. For Chicagoans who lived through it, the story became a quiet, lingering reminder of vulnerability. Parks that had once been neutral spaces, places of leisure, exercise, and routine, carried an invisible tension. Joggers adjusted their schedules, parents lingered at playgrounds in uneasy anticipation, and citizens walked streets more warily, noting details previously dismissed: an odd gait, a shadow lingering too long, footsteps that seemed out of sync with the crowd. In this sense, the Duck Walk killer reshaped ordinary perception, embedding a subtle paranoia into daily life that refused to dissipate, even without a resolution. The law enforcement community also carried a lasting lesson. The case became emblematic of the limits of surveillance, technology, and procedural methodology. Even in an era of near-ubiquitous cameras and advanced analytics, the man who moved with that distinctive, almost theatrical gait remained beyond capture. Police departments revisited protocols, improved evidence preservation, and refined approaches to video analysis, all while acknowledging a humbling truth: no system, no matter how advanced, can completely substitute for human insight or anticipate a criminal's ingenuity. In training sessions and seminars, the Duck Walk killer became a cautionary archetype, a scenario illustrating how a single, unresolved figure could outmaneuver even the most sophisticated resources. Media and public imagination, too, ensured that the case would never fade entirely. The footage, still circulating online, served as both documentation and symbol, inspiring podcasts, documentaries, and true crime discussions that dissected motive, psychology, and methodology. The duck walk became shorthand for the uncatchable, a gesture that represented the tension between visibility and anonymity, movement and identity, fear and fascination. It transformed the killer into a modern urban myth, a presence defined not by what he did, but by the unsettling way he moved, leaving behind only questions and a chilling impression that lingers long after the crime itself. Perhaps most poignantly, the victims' families carry the weight of unanswered questions. Their grief exists not only in the loss of life, but in the absence of explanation, closure, or justice. Each anniversary, each resurfacing of the footage, is a reminder that the man responsible remains unaccounted for, and that the ordinary fabric of the city they inhabit is interwoven with the memory of a man who could strike and vanish without trace. In the end, the Duckwalk Killer case is not simply a story of murder. It is a study of fear, memory, and the limits of human understanding. It challenges assumptions about surveillance, evidence, and the idea that documentation guarantees truth. It reveals how even a single, peculiar trait, a walk, can dominate public imagination, law enforcement strategy, and urban mythology for years, shaping the culture of a city in ways both subtle and profound. Chicago will always remember, not because the case was solved, but because it was experienced, a haunting lesson that some crimes cannot be fully understood, some killers cannot be caught, and some mysteries endure as a living part of the city's identity. The Duckwalk Killer remains unseen, unnamed, and unresolved, yet his shadow continues to stretch across the streets, a chilling testament to the persistence of fear and the enduring power of the unknown.